This is the No Risk Podcast, powered by CS Medical.
Welcome to the No Risk Podcast, powered by CS Medical. I'm Jill Holdsworth, the Medical Affairs Manager here at CS Medical, and I am joined by our special guest, Brandon Gantt. Brandon, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And I am so sorry, it is Dr. Brandon Gantt.
Yeah,
My
sometimes.
apologies. Dr. Brandon Gantt, why don't you give us a little bit of information about yourself, what you're doing these days, and a little background?
I am currently the Manager of Training, Education, and Quality for Christiana Care. I like to consider myself a healthcare researcher, patient safety advocate, and workforce development expert.
That is a lot of stuff that you consider yourself. I love it.
I know, I like to keep busy, super busy.
Well, that is great because today we are going to dig all into education, competencies, all of the above. So let's just dig right in. Why are infection preventionists so concerned with the education of those in sterile processing and reprocessing spaces?
Because I honestly think that for a long time, education of sterile processing was a gray area. There was not a lot of robust foundation or competencies in that area. And it kind of leaves open a lot of worrying situations. And so I can understand why infection preventionists would kind of hone in on that, because when you look at the education space within sterile processing and look at our educators and compare that to an OR educator, there's not a lot of criteria there. And so when you consider the people who are supposed to be training and teaching, where there's no real criteria behind who they are, then what type of education are they giving the sterile processing department? It can be a little scary.
Now, do you feel like IPs have a role in the education? Should they just be attending the education that is given by the educators? Or how do you feel like IPs fit into what's already being done?
I feel like there should definitely be a partnership. I've always partnered with my IPs, and you were one of them. I feel like they make a perfect partnership. It makes perfect partners. I think that they can lean on each other. The sterile processing educator can kind of discover some of the things that IPs are looking for when it comes to instrumentation issues in the OR. And maybe those would be learning opportunities for the technicians in the sterile processing area. So I think they can definitely lean on each other.
Now, one of the areas I always found to be very challenging were the areas outside of the OR. So you had the OR proper, and then you had like women's health, IR, all of those other spaces that didn't always seem to be as covered by the educators that covered the OR and SPD themselves. Have you seen that in your work too? And who is not necessarily supposed to cover those areas, but how are those areas covered so that everybody gets kind of that same level of education support?
I think that is probably a pathway for the future, because I think that area is still not completely covered like it should be. I think when we look at sterile process and we look at the OR, we definitely have dedicated people to those areas. But then when you go into like the ambulatory areas or clinic areas, there's nobody really there to support them like there should be. And that definitely is a problem that I think organizations really need to consider how they're developing a role or maybe expanding the overview of the SPD educator. So that way that there's somebody that those areas can kind of rely on or engage with or get like annual competencies, continuing education. Because right now, I do feel like that's something that's not really happening. And that's something that we need to focus on in the future.
Let's say I'm a brand new IP, but I am responsible for educating all of the areas outside of the OR because there isn't anybody to educate any of those areas. But I don't really know what I'm talking about. So where can I learn about those areas or get education so that I can be competent to educate those areas?
I think definitely probably turning toward the Healthcare Sterile Processing Association. I really do feel like that IPs probably should also have a certification in sterile processing as well. So that way they can be a little bit more well-versed in that area. Also visiting your sterile process department to see how medical device reprocessing really happens. And that way partnering with your educator, your manager, your supervisor to kind of get trained, a little bit more training a little bit more boots on the ground experience, and to see what people are really doing. So that way, hopefully, the IFP can be successful when they leave and walk into those areas like OBGYN and IR and so forth.
So let's touch on that HSPA certification just a little bit more. So it's called the CRCST, which some people may recognize those letters. It does require 400 hours of boots on the ground experience, as you call it. So if there's an IP that wants to get that, but they think, oh my gosh, I'll never get 400 hours, what would be your advice to them?
There are so many different ways. Even now, within my role at Christiana Care, we have students who come in who devote any time that they can to actually spending time in the department and walking through each step from decontamination to assembly to sterilization. I think, if anything, that novice IP probably should not count themselves out, because I think it goes a lot faster and it's a lot easier than people realize, but you have to really be invested in it. I mean, if you want to be a contributor to good outcomes, then you actually have to do the work. And so don't shy away from the sterile processing area. It can be overwhelming. I mean, there's so much stuff going on, and it can just seem like a lot, something that you'll never pick up. But you just have to, I mean, you just have to stick with it, because, I've seen so many people who come in who've never had any type of healthcare experience at all, and they get things right away. And I feel like the IP is really well versed. There is like some education related to sterilization and infection and decontamination, and those that education. So I think they already have like a start, but coming to a department I think it would be easy.
And you have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And you're spending time as an IP in the department anyways. So you might as well start recording those hours. It may take you a couple years, but you're already spending time in there anyway. So you might as well start keeping track of your hours. That's what I tell people all the time. Like, yeah, it's possible. It might take you a little while.
Yeah, and I think in the grand scheme of things and like your schedule, just make sure that it's something that you can probably regularly schedule. It shouldn't be
Hmm.
an area that you just plan to visit once a month, but if you can get that on your schedule weekly to kind of just round in the area, and even have somebody partner with you and take you through to kind of introduce everything to you, it actually adds up. Those hours add up quickly.
So let's talk about the annual competency requirements. So there's a lot of things that require annual competencies. Do you
Mhm.
feel like that's enough for all of these things that people are learning and maybe they don't do it again for a year? And what do you think?
No, I mean, annual comps are just a pathway. I think it's like a roadmap, but I definitely feel like that education needs to be reinforced multiple times throughout the year. One of the things that I love to do is refresher education, because just imagine if you are taught how to drive a car and then you only drive that car every, I don't know, 8 weeks or every 16 weeks. I don't think we'd be excellent drivers. And so I know that there are instrument sets, or there are scopes, or there are certain things within the sterile processing department that people don't touch weekly. Yes, they get training on it when they first start. We may go over it with an annual competency, but it shouldn't end just there. You kind of have to take a look at what are like high risk instrumentation, look at your quality data reports if your organization collects metrics on things that maybe have gone wrong in the OR. And that will actually help you build your educational plans throughout the year. So that way you can kind of give people a reminder, whether it's every 4 months or whether it's every 6 months. Because the education really just never stops. It's not going to just be something that you get annually or just when you start.
And how do you use those metrics that you're using to build education plans? How do you as the educator plus the department leader, how does everybody work together to see not only what needs to be reinforced more, but also what's at risk behavior versus just needing reinforced, or maybe we need different workflows?
I think sometimes you have to, every issue that happens, you have to investigate it thoroughly because sometimes things are just minor, like not including an indicator in a tray. And so that's something that probably just requires you to reinforce that at a huddle versus maybe dirty instruments winding up in a tray, which that probably requires you to kind of go back and retrain somebody and shadow them and see how they are actually cleaning a set. And so I think you really have to just sit down, like with me as an educator, sitting down with the manager and kind of say, okay, well, what's the low hanging fruit? And then what's stuff that's really dangerous? And then how can we pattern things from here? Is it an educational in service? Is it something we announce at huddle? Is it something that we actually have to reach out to the vendor to come in and give us education on because it's been so long since we had I think the subject matter expert in. And so it's definitely something that you look at on a case by case basis.
One of the topics that we hear often is pre-cleaning. Pre-cleaning is difficult. So you've got your instrument pre-cleaning, which is obviously in the OR. We've got TEE pre-cleaning, which we hear is most difficult when we're trying to work with anesthesia. Is that something that you guys are having to work with? And do you see when you're working with different groups of procedural staff that sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder?
Oh, yeah. There's a definite difference between like different groups of folks. I think everybody struggles with pre-cleaning. Like I would be lying to you if I said everything was perfect. But we always want to reinforce the importance of pre-cleaning. And for me, even partnering with whether it's our OR educators to kind of give in services again to round in those areas and take pictures to make sure that everybody understands just how something should be pre-cleaned after a procedure is done. What are the next steps to take with that instrument before it gets to the reprocessing area? Because, there are people who they may forget. They may think, well, this really is not something that I'm supposed to do. Once it gets to its final destination, that's where all the cleaning is supposed to happen, but that's not the case. And I think it's just something that we kind of have to reinforce with those individuals that, yeah, pre-cleaning actually starts in the point of use area. So, whether it's from the OR or, wherever else, procedure room, that we're actually going to start the decontamination process there.
Do you think that's the breakdown is they just don't understand where the cleaning is supposed to happen?
I think so. I think for a lot of people, whether it's sterile processing or whether it's somebody in a scope room, they feel like that they are the owners of cleaning, that they are the experts. And so every bit of cleaning is done there. But I think if you go back and you have to really, even show somebody the instructions for use, because there are some people who just are not familiar with that to really say, well, no, this is actually according to the manufacturer, this is where this is supposed to start. And this is something that you are supposed to do. And if there's any gaps in that, then we have to figure out, well, why are there gaps in that? Why are there gaps in that understanding? Do we have to go back and retrain this individual or this whole group of people overall so that way they have a better understanding of the complete cleaning process?
And how do you think IPs could impact this process?
I think for IPs, it's probably to just round in those areas a lot. I think to observe and to see what is happening and also to collect or probably take back any pertinent data to whether it's the educator or whether it's the manager of that area. So that way, I think there's just a clearer picture of what's at stake when those steps are skipped.
One thing I have noticed, I don't know if you have noticed this, but when we talk about instrumentation, there's a lot of KPIs or key performance indicators with pre-cleaning when it
Hmm.
comes to instrumentation. And we tend to blow those up so that the OR knows, you're only pre-cleaning your instruments 40% of the time. When it comes to TEE probes, when it comes to ultrasound probes, that kind of information, those KPIs, they don't really exist. And I haven't really figured out why. Why aren't we having KPIs around probes just like we do for instruments? And maybe we just aren't there yet, but why do you think that is?
I think there is a false sense of security around probes. I mean, I've been shocked. I've been digging into probes a little bit more lately since I've been at Christiana, and even looking at some of the IFUs in training material for certain products. You know, it's scary because in some cases they only require like a wipe, and that's about it. And so I definitely feel like people look at the probe as if it is an innocent product or item, and it does not require a high level of cleaning. And so we've kind of put that on the back burner in the grand scheme of things, where we've focused so much on stainless steel instrumentation
Hmm.
or flexible endoscopes, but don't leave out the probes.
Yeah, we totally agree.
Yeah.
And we know that wipes aren't enough,
Mhm.
and we've been kind of shocked at some of the IFUs
Yeah.
and some of the suggestions that are made. But yeah, I would like to see the industry move towards KPIs for ultrasound probes too, so that we can say, like, okay, your TEE department is only pre-cleaning 30% of the time. You know what? That's a problem.
Well, I
So
think that's why education is so important. And I feel like, especially with what CS Medical has been doing, because I've been on those end services, it's important that that information is out there, that somebody is kind of like leading that cause and
yeah.
saying, okay, let's raise the red flag. Let's stop and let's adjust some things. So let's have a deeper conversation, and let's have more requirements behind these items. So kudos to CS Medical.
Well, we appreciate that. Let's switch and talk a little bit about adult learning. This is something that I love. I have small children at home, so I feel like I've maybe mastered how children think, but now that I'm getting into teenagers, I'm at a loss again. But adult learners are totally different, right?
They definitely are. And I actually have to look at myself and how I like to learn. I think it took me a long time to realize that I needed to stand up for myself when I went to school and really figure out what was working for me and what wasn't working. And, even now when I go to school, I kind of like to just be given information. Give me everything that I need. Let me read through it. Let me process it. If I need you, I'll come back. And I know over time in my teaching career, whether it's teaching at hospitals or teaching at colleges, the one thing that I never stopped to do was to ask the adult learner student how they like to learn. That was kind of something that was blind to me. It's something I just kind of ignored. I was just there to lecture and go on about my business. But a few years ago, I actually had to pause and I actually created a survey to say, well, how do you like to learn? What's the best way for you to receive information? Is it visually? Is it auditory? Do you need to be hands on? Because, everything is not as cut and dry. People are different. So sometimes material needs to be planned differently for individuals. Sometimes you need to slow down. Sometimes you need to let people just kind of like study on their own or move on their own. But I think if anything, you really do have to stop and say, well, wait a minute, I have 18 people in this class. I know everybody's not going to process things the same way. So let me at least ask, and then I can pattern things after the comments that I receive.
And as an educator, is that hard? Like, were you shocked by some of the answers? Did it make you have extra work to create different methods of learning?
It is sometimes hard, but if anything, as an educator, I like to create a safety net. So my schedule is almost usually a little fluid. So even if you're onboarding somebody into a department and you're bringing in a sterile processing technician or somebody who's working in an area where they're going to be reprocessing medical devices, yes, you may set out a time frame, 90 days to onboard them, but you have to have the understanding that that time is fluid. And so you may have somebody who gets all of that foundational knowledge, because that's all it is, just foundational knowledge. They're not an expert, but you get that foundational knowledge after 90 days. But then there are some people where you have to adjust that time where, okay, we have to go back and revisit this because they need a little bit more time, or maybe they didn't understand all of the concepts. So if anything, you do have to realize that, it takes time. It's not a race. And so you want to set people up for success. And so I always try to make sure that, yeah, even though it can be difficult for me, but I am here to make sure that people are successful at their job. And if they're successful, then the patient is safer.
What advice would you have for IPs who are coming into these reprocessing spaces because they often don't have time to do the whole like 7 ways of educating people? They may just have 2 minutes at a huddle or gathering everybody together really quick in the department. So, what would be the best strategy for IPs to get a message out? And is that even effective?
It is, if anything, think outside the box. That's what I've had to do recently. Think outside the box when you're delivering information. Huddles are great, but there are so many different ways to spread information within an organization. I actually created a sterile processing education SharePoint page where we can actually host videos and messages from different people, whether it's me or somebody from IP. So you can record a video message. You can do things, spread information through other means like gaming. People love gamification. I'm not really big on games, but people do. People love games. And so I think if anything, don't limit yourself when it comes to spreading information. I think utilize the resources that you do have and try to make things as engaging as possible. Because yes, in the grand scheme of things, you may only have 2 minutes, but it's up to you how you actually utilize that 2 minutes, whether it's 2 minutes at a computer posting a video or coming to somebody's department to say, hey, this is what I want you to learn today.
And I don't know how to do those games, but I will tell you that in like middle school and high school, they're using them like crazy to teach and review. Like they're called like gim kits and blue kits and all these things. And I've played on my kids' things and they're fun. And you don't even realize you're learning something because you're playing a game. So I think the younger crowd is doing more electronic things. Whereas like for me, I'd rather have a piece of paper that I highlight and take handwritten notes on. So everybody's a little different. I think that's the point is we have to appeal to all the different learning styles. Whereas some people are more electronic and some of us like to handwrite our notes and highlight in a book.
Yeah, I think gamification is huge, and that's why I wear my gray hair so proudly because I want people to know I'm old and I might not understand all the concepts. So take your time with me.
Yeah, yeah. I feel the same way. I hope people know take your time with me too. I'm not going to be able to do the gaming thingies. Let's talk a little bit about AMI standards, Joint Commission. Like, what are we seeing out there that our surveyors are looking for, and what's out there in our requirements?
I think our surveyors are actually becoming more thorough. They're really understanding the sterile processing space and sterile processing department. And so, even when you think about competencies and you look at competencies that have been created, like AOR enhanced competencies for sterile processing, they are actually following those now. And one of the things that I realized when I walk into an organization is that the more robust your competencies, the better off you are because our surveyors are coming in and they are observing everything. They really know their stuff nowadays and they're looking at your documentation. They're taking deep dives into it. They're asking you to walk them through like the screens and everything. And so they really are becoming like sharper. And I think if anything, we have to be prepared for that. I mean, it's a part of our normal everyday teaching or everyday onboarding, but we can't take any shortcuts because they are not taking any shortcuts.
And I talk about this a lot, but in the new Joint Commission wording, it will say in the competency section that they actually want to see that you can do certain competencies. And the two examples they give are donning and doffing your PPE and your HLD processes. So do you feel like people are preparing for that, that they can actually walk through all of the HLD processes? Because they're not going to ask you, right?
No, they're not. They're not going to ask me. I mean, they're going to talk to the staff. And the one thing that we do is we still are in a space where we kind of like to leave no gaps. And so even in our HLD space, we have wall charts for every aspect that you should be going through when you're reprocessing scope. The same thing when you go back to the decontamination area, we actually have like the process for donning, the sequence for donning your PPE and also for doffing your PPE because you can't expect somebody to remember every single thing. There's a lot of stuff to remember in sterile processing in our HLD spaces. And so you can't just leave it to people's memory. And so you want to just better prepare folks for that. And, it's not hard to have a wall chart.
And you're allowed to reference
Yes.
things like wall charts during surveys. I think
Yes.
people forget that instead of saying, I don't know, or blabbing something wrong, which I see happen a lot.
Yeah, never say, I don't know. Never guess. You can always say, let me research that because they
Mhm.
will accept that.
Or I'll get back
That's
to
something
you.
I'll get back to you. Yeah.
Yeah. As we close out this episode, what final advice would you have for any IPs out there to help with education in all of these reprocessing areas as they prepare for surveys or prepare for anything that's coming up that's needed in their hospital?
I think it's important to have regular engagement with your those areas. I think people look for that. I think when be prepared before the survey comes. You shouldn't just be survey ready a month before the survey is about to happen. That should happen all year long. Be survey ready all year long and just make yourself available when there are questions that need to be asked or if an issue does happen for research purposes. Partner with your SPD manager, partner with your SPD educator, because we all want to get it right the first time versus Joint Commission having to come back and review things again.
And one thing I have always told people is go to the in-services that are happening in SPD. Because if you're there, you know what they're hearing. One time I went to an in-service and then I went and asked the manager what the policy was and what the in-service said, what the policy was, what the technicians thought they heard. All three things were different. So you have to be present to make sure everything's aligning and everything heard the same thing. And then if you heard the in-service, you can be there and help too. And sometimes that means going at like 6 a.m, which kind of stinks, but still processing starts early, right?
It does start. It does start early, but I think that's why we want that partnership because we want to actually work together. We want to plan stuff together. We want to really sit down and tackle like IFUs because there've been IFUs that I've read and I said, well, I don't know if this actually makes sense or is it even doable? And so maybe I have to grab my IP and say,
Yeah.
well, we probably need to have a conversation about this because I'm not sure if we have the tools or even if we have the ability to actually clean this effectively and what can we do. So yeah, I think you're
And
absolutely
that's
right.
where risk assessment would probably come into play, which I know we hear that term all the time. Do a risk assessment when things get dicey and you don't know if you can do things. But yeah, that's a perfect time to pull in the IP
Mhm.
and say, we've got to look at this together because we have a conflict between the IFU and what we can do, what we can't do. And it happens more often than not because things are being purchased without the input of SPD, without the input of IP.
Constantly.
Yeah. So that's a perfect time for all of these groups to come together.
We'll be right back after this message from CS Medical. Transporting delicate TEE ultrasound probes requires protection, consistency, and care. The T-Porter TEE ultrasound probe transportation case securely carries clean probes to the procedure area and returns soiled probes for reprocessing. Its rugged construction, clear locking cover, molded compartments, and clean and dirty status labels help protect probes, reduce staff exposure to biological material, and support a standardized workflow from the procedure room to reprocessing. T-Porter, secure transport for every step of the process.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of the No Risk Podcast, powered by CS Medical.
At CS Medical, education is essential to safer, more confident care. New and existing customers can access 24/7 web-based training or schedule on-site education for their teams and also explore IP insights to register for weekly webinars offering free continuing education credits. Visit csmedicalllc.com to learn more or call 919-255-9472. Thank you for listening to the No Risk Podcast powered by CS Medical. And join us again next time on the No Risk Podcast. The information shared in this podcast is that of the contributor and should be reviewed by the consumer as that expressed by an independent party to CS Medical or in conjunction with CS Medical staff. The subject matter may or may not directly represent any employer, company, or third party, and are solely that of the individuals or contributors themselves.